The Holy Gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ, according to Luke.
Glory be to thee, O Lord.
On the way to Jerusalem, Jesus was going through the region between Samaria and Galilee. As he entered a village, 10 lepers approached him. Keeping their distance, they called out, saying, "Jesus, Master, have mercy on us." When he saw them, he said to them, "Go and show yourselves to the priest." And as they went, they were made clean. Then one of them, when he saw that he was healed, turned back, praising God with a loud voice. He prostrated himself at Jesus' feet and thanked him. And he was a Samaritan. Then Jesus asked, "Were not 10 made clean? But the other 9, where are they? Was none of them found to return and give praise to God except this foreigner?" Then he said to him, "Get up and go your way. Your faith has made you well." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise be to thee, O Christ.
O God, illumine our hearts and give the grace of understanding. Through Christ we pray. Amen. It was Oscar Wilde, I'm told, who wrote the words of this familiar couplet. 2 men looked through the self-same bars. One saw mud, the other stars. It was his way of pointing up one of the great enigmas of our human saga. That is, why do individuals respond so differently to the same stimulus? Here were 2 individuals looking out on an identical terrain, and one pair of eyes looked down at the dirtiest and the grimiest of all the elements there, while the other eyes elevated up to the loveliest and the most sublime of the dimensions. And you find yourself wondering what accounts for that diversity of response. George Buttrick probes the same mystery with a different set of images. He wonders out loud, why does the same sun melt the wax and harden the clay? Why do you suppose this happens? Well, of course, the answer to this question, if you stop and think about it, can be traced back to this gift of freedom that separates human beings from the rocks and the plants. We have what is called the burden of responsibility, which Stephen Covey reminds us is the ability to respond. That is, we're subjects and not just objects. We certainly live in a world where we don't control everything, but we do have the power to decide how we are going to respond to the events that happen to us. If you take any moment of my life and analyze it, it's going to be a composite of what life has done to me and what I have chosen to do back to life. We are not victims. There is in the human condition that mysterious gift of freedom that enables us to make our own individual responses, and therefore there's no anticipating in advance when 2 people look through the self-same bars how they're going to use that freedom. Or when life puts us under the heat of pressure, there is simply no way of knowing whether we're going to melt or whether we're going to harden. And I was reminded of that as I worked this week with the little story that is our gospel lesson of the morning. You heard it read just a moment ago from Luke's gospel. Jesus is moving through a village, and 10 lepers at a great distance cry out to this famous holy man for some help. There was something about their cut-offness, their isolation. There was something about their slow wasting away that struck a deep chord in Jesus' heart. And so he directed toward them some of that power of wholeness that came through him from the Father, and they were healed in the twinkling of an eye. He lifted the burden of leprosy off of them. And then he told them to go and show themselves to the priest, which in that culture was the process by which a leper was allowed to re-enter society. And the story is that after that happened, one of the lepers took the trouble to come back and look Jesus up and to thank him for the gift that he had bequeathed to them. And as this happened, Jesus says, refresh my memory. Were not there 10 lepers who were cleansed? Where are the other 9? Why has only one come back to give an expression of gratitude? Well, in a wonderful little book called The Way of the Wolf, Martin Bell picks up on that question of Jesus, where are the 9? And he uses his imagination to explore this incredible gift of freedom that is so much a part of our human condition. That is, he lets himself speculate on what happened to the other 9 that had this gift of healing happen to them. He admits it's speculation, it's not rooted in the Scripture, and yet I find what he does to be very intriguing because it reminds me of the immensity of possibility that open out to every one of us in a given event. For example, he speculates that one of the lepers may well have been so frightened and so confused by what Jesus did that he simply responded the way we humans do under the impact of fear. That is, he ran and hid. The power of Jesus was so awesome to him that it scared him out of his wits, and all he knew to do was to find a safe place. Or again, Bell speculates that perhaps another one of those lepers didn't come back to say thank you because he was offended at how easily this had occurred and how little it had demanded of him. You see, he may have been the kind of person who thought that you only get what you pay for, that there's no such thing as a free lunch. He had thought about the wonder of being healed, but he had always assumed that it would require demanding and difficult things of him. He'd have to change his diet. He would have to do lots of exercises. He might have to go through a regimen of spiritual purgation. He felt if he didn't have to do a great deal, then nothing of value could actually come. And therefore this healing seemed to him to be cheap grace, and he couldn't trust it, and so he didn't come back to say thank you. Another one of the lepers, he speculates, may have found when he got to the priest that he didn't want to be healed after all. You see, leprosy had become a way of life to him, his very identity. He found that he didn't want to have to get up every morning and go to work. He didn't want to bear the burdens that go with being a load-bearing person in the community. He had found in his sickness an escape from the demands of life that he found preferable, and therefore instead of coming back to say thank you, he rushed away to another leper to try to get reinfected as quickly as possible. Perhaps another one of these lepers was simply a childlike person in mind. That is, he never bothered to put things together. For him, life was just a jumble of isolated particulars. And therefore, he was delighted to find that he was healed. It was wonderful to be well again. But he ambled off from the priest in the same kind of unconsciousness in which he lived his whole life. He simply went like a dog, sniffing from one flower pot to another, never connecting up that this event is why that event happened. Bell speculates that perhaps another one of these men had become so embittered by having to always beg that he had lost the capacity to say thank you. He found it so demeaning to always have to reach out his hands in supplication. It implied that somebody else was up and he was always down. It had shriveled his spirit so he couldn't even get the words thank you out of his mouth and into the presence of another person. Bell speculates that another one of the lepers perhaps was a woman whose great identity in life had been being a wife and a mother. And the worst thing about her leprosy was that she couldn't be with her family and do what she wanted to do for them. It was a worse pain than the physical debilitation that was taking place. And so as soon as she realized that she was healed, she was like an animal that had been set free from a trap. She lost no time in getting back to where she most wanted to be. She didn't come back to say thank you because she was in a run to get home and get back in the harness. Or again, perhaps one of these lepers, says Bell, was a skeptic by temperament. He prided himself in not jumping to conclusions too quickly. He was always one to analyze everything very carefully. And therefore he said to himself, I realize that I have been healed, but how do I know that this event is connected to what that man back in the village said? I've got to look at this some more. I've got to consider other options. He was the kind of person who made up his life concretely, but could never make up his mind intellectually. And so he couldn't come to some definitive thank you because he was still trying to analyze exactly why this had happened. Or again, says Bell, maybe one of these lepers was a caring, empathic person, and as soon as he realized that healing had come, he thought of all his other leper friends who were still afflicted, and so he didn't come back to say thank you, because he was going to get other lepers, and what he intended to do was to bring them to Jesus in the hope of healing as well. But another leper was very much like him, says Bell. He assumed that when this had occurred, that the Messiah had in fact entered history, that the kingdom had in fact come, and so he did not come back to thank Jesus because he became an evangelist. He was out telling everybody that the time is fulfilled, the kingdom is at hand, and that the one that they had looked for had at last arrived. Now I remind you that all of this is speculation. None of it is based on the text. And yet what Martin Bell has done has two great values for me. The first of all, it reminds me of the tremendous power of this freedom that every one of us possess. It reminds me of the infinite possibilities that open out before us in a given moment. That is, something happens and then we have the power to say something back to it. And the incredible range of possibility that opens to every one of us is something we need to consider very carefully. The other thing this says to me is that we need to be very careful in jumping to conclusions about other people's behavior. Martin Bell says it is so much easier to condemn than to try to understand and investigate why people do what they do. That is, if we only take a snapshot of somebody's actions, if we only look on the surface, chances are we may not realize why it was that they acted as they did. There's an old French adage that to know all is to forgive all. And perhaps that's an overstatement, but it is a truth, I think, that when we are so quick to jump to conclusions about other people's behavior, we may not know the depths of circumstances that caused their freedom to act as they did. You know, I have been so wrong so often about so many people because I did not know everything I needed to know. I remember when I was in college back at Baylor University in Texas, there was a man I met when I first got there that from the very first struck me as one of the most aloof and arrogant and unfriendly of people I'd ever known. Back in those days on that campus, there was an ethos of friendliness. You simply spoke to people when you passed them on the campus, and this man absolutely disdained that. He would walk by you as if he'd never even seen you, had his nose in the air as if he was some kind of better than everybody else. And his aloofness triggered my insecurities. I developed real disdain for this person. I remember even saying critical things about him to other people. Well, in the summer between my junior and senior year, I was asked to participate in a religious youth event in a church in Decatur, Georgia. And when I got there, to my surprise, there he was, sitting on the front row, because that was his home parish, and he was active there. And my first reaction was a negative one. I thought, oh gosh, I hate to have to bump into his arrogance for several days. But the events of that week forced me to be in closer contact with him than I'd ever been before, and I made an amazing discovery. He had a congenital eye problem, something that from birth had given him extreme nearsightedness, and the truth was he could not recognize somebody even when they were just a few feet away. And the way he had learned to relate this walking as if everybody else was made of plate glass was not because he was arrogant, but it was because he could not see. And what I discovered was, behind those defective eyes was a lonely and extremely loving person. And I had missed it 180 degrees because I did not bother to investigate. I had simply chosen to condemn. Now, Jesus tells us not to judge each other, and I think for one reason, and that is that we rarely have enough information to come to dogmatic conclusions. If most of the charges we made against other people ever got to court, they would probably be dismissed on the basis of insufficient evidence. We oftentimes don't know enough to be judgmental of other people. Because I believe Jesus practiced what he preached, I cannot see this question that he asked in the story to be a question of condemnation. When he asked, were not 10 healed, where are the other 9? He is not saying that in bitterness. He is asking that question in deep sadness, not sadness for himself, but sadness for those other 9. Because you see, Jesus had not healed his people just to get them to come up and give him gratitude. He had given them a wonderful gift of healing. And Jesus knew that if we don't practice the discipline of gratitude, then the greatest of all tragedies can happen. That is, something that is potential to bless us is thereby wasted on us. If we don't learn to live in the spirit of gratitude, and I mean by that to notice what is happening, to trace back those good things to the sources either in other people or in God, if we don't go to the trouble to build an altar of gratitude as an appropriate response to an event of blessing, then we miss the deeper meaning of what God was trying to give us in that moment. And that's what's back of that question, where are the 9? Jesus is not judging them in a condemning sense. He is genuinely sad that something wonderful had happened, and 9 of the people didn't go to the trouble to let all that God was trying to give go to the depths of their being. I met a new friend this summer in a bookshop in Texas. She's a Benedictine nun who lives in a monastery in Fort Smith, Arkansas. I was telling somebody this week that I didn't realize there were any Benedictines in Arkansas. I had somehow never put these two realities together, but sure enough, there is. Her name is Macrina Whitaker. She lives in a monastery. She has for many years been a Benedictine, and she has written a beautiful little book entitled A Tree Full of Angels. And Sister Macrina tells in that book that as a young Catholic monastic, she used to pray to God to deliver her from the fate of eternal death, to keep her from that state of ultimate lifelessness. But she says now that she has grown and mellowed, she has changed that prayer and asked God to deliver her from shallow living. She said the truth is that they're the same prayer, only spoken out of deeper understanding. Because the truth is that shallow living will eventually get us to eternal death. That is, if you don't notice what is happening, if you don't swim back upstream and get in touch with the sources, if you don't go to the trouble to build an altar of thanksgiving as an appropriate response to an event of blessing, then the most tragic of all things is happening. Life is being wasted on you, and the joy that God meant for you to have is somehow not getting through. As I heard her tell of this shift from fearing eternal death to fearing shallow living, it caused me to reflect on my own life. I think I had to admit as I read it that for the first 37 and a half years of my life, I lived in the shallows. That is, I really did take life for granted. I really did let the spirit of wonder somehow get shriveled up in my heart. I had my growing pains, I had my difficulties, but I simply took as a matter of course, almost as an entitlement, that I had a good job, that my health was intact, that I had been given the gift of 2 wonderful children. I lived in the shallows because I didn't notice. I didn't swim back upstream. I built very few altars of thanksgiving. And then in the middle of my 37th year, my only daughter was stricken with a serious illness, diagnosed as having acute leukemia. That was the beginning of an 18-month effort to somehow ward off death and somehow save her life, and that effort was unsuccessful. And just after I turned 40, I became a person of sorrow, acquainted with grief. I was initiated into the fraternity of the bereaved. And I remember as I tried to work my way through that first real traumatic blow that had ever come into my life, I think one of the greatest pains that came to me was the realization that for all of those 40 years, I had taken for granted what I now saw as an incredible gift, and I had never been appropriately thankful. I had never gone like that one good leper and found the source of it and bowed down and gave thanks. Kahil Gibran says, and ever it has been, that love knows not its own depths until the moment of separation. And isn't that tragic? That we don't notice how good life is until suddenly something that we see as a grace is taken away from us. I have to admit that I was like the characters in Thornton Wilder's famous play, Our Town. You remember Emily, the little girl in the play, died and goes to heaven. And she wants very much to come back and relive just one day in her life on earth. And the stage manager says that's not a good idea. You'll find it to be very disappointing. From the vantage point of what you know now, going back to that blindness is not going to be pleasing. But she insisted. And so Emily comes back on the day of her 12th birthday. And what is startling to her is that nobody really notices. Nobody is really in touch with the depths of things. And after living for a day as people are so blind, she says to the stage manager, does nobody ever realize the wonder of life while they're living it? And the stage manager said sadly, few people do. Maybe the poets, maybe the artists, but few people realize the wonder while they're living it. And that was true of me. But I want to confess to you this morning that encounter with my shallowness proved to be a watershed in my own journey. And I remembered that freedom that was ours, that freedom that was mine. I didn't have to go on living in the shallows as I realized in the darkness of bereavement that I had been doing. And I still remember distinctly that watershed moment when the way of doing life gratefully really opened up for me. After Laura Lue died, I had trouble sleeping, which is a common symptom of grief. You somehow can't lay down your burden even though you're so weary. And I got up in the night, couldn't sleep, and went down in my study and kind of thoughtlessly pulled down a commentary of the book of Genesis by Gerhard von Rad. I turned to the 22nd chapter, which is that dark account of God asking Abraham to offer his beloved Isaac on some mountain back as a sacrifice. I'd never been able to make much sense of that except it was a hangover of his old paganism, what God was trying to lead him out of. But that night, the German von Rad gave me a whole new vision of that passage. He said what God was trying to discover was, did Abraham remember where Isaac came from and who Isaac really was? Did he realize that life is gift and birth is windfall, and that all of it comes to us out of incredible graciousness? Or had he begun to look on Isaac as his own possession? Had he begun to grasp Isaac as if he was his and his alone? That was the issue. Well, if you know the story, Abraham did pass the test. He did remember who Isaac had always been. And therefore he was willing to make oblation of that which had first been gift to him. And all of a sudden it hit me. Laura Lue was in your life the same way Isaac was in Abraham's life. She never belonged to me. She was never a possession to which I could claim I earned her or I deserve her. That she had ever been in my life at all was incredible, incredible good fortune. And that was the night I decided that instead of spending the rest of my days being angry that she had been taken so quickly, I was going to spend the rest of my days being grateful that she'd ever lived at all. And from that moment until this, the one song of my life, you know it well, the one song of my life is life is gift and birth is windfall. And that being the case, and our being free, gratitude is the gateway to the highest joy, and not noticing, not swimming back upstream, not building altars of gratitude, that's the formula for eternal death. And therefore this morning, as you hear the story, I've got to end by asking you the question, where do you find yourself among these 10 free people who responded so differently to the same stimulus? Do you see yourself in the image of that one who, recognizing the grace of it all, noticed, swam upstream, and built his altar of gratitude? Or are you living in the shallows, never really noticing, never really tracing it back, and never saying thank you? One of the ways you can answer that question is simply pondering the question, how do you handle the stewardship of your life? Shallow giving is a sign of shallow living, and being generous and grateful for what we have is a sign that we're on the way to the highest joy. He didn't ask it in anger. He asked it in sadness. Where are the 9? I have to ask, where are you?